I was having a little bit of trouble putting my thoughts into words, so I thought I'd try a different medium. And now the moment we have all been waiting for, wacky time!
Thank you. Can you guys hear me all right with this microphone? How about now? Can you hear me at the back? I want to see someone wave their hands. Super. You can hear me. So I'm going to start my slides. There's my slide. Much different. So, wow, thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening to what I'm going to start talking about, which is comics, webcomics, dinosaur comics, which is my comic. It's it's a comic where the pictures don't change. I just put in new words every day. So in that way, I'm kind of a hack and not really a cartoonist. But I thought I'd start, instead of just starting to launch in and talk about myself, I'd give you a brief history of where comics came from, how we got where we are now, and the conclusion is going to be how webcomics are saving the medium from itself and why what we're doing is really important work for the entire medium. So I hope we can travel with me there and agree that that's what's happening. So we're going to start with the definition of comics. This is a mouthful. Scott McCloud came up with it. He's a really good comics theorist and a delightful dinner guest. And comics are juxtaposed, pictorial, and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and/or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. That's a mouthful. It seems pretty intuitive. We can shrink it down to a more memorable thing, which is comics are juxtaposed, pictorial, and other images in deliberate sequence. Pretty handy definition. It misses some stuff like single-panel comics where you only have one image. There's no sequence there. You lose out on things like Far Side, which were single-panel. You lose out on... You include comics that don't have any words, but you also lose out on things like cave drawings, which I kind of think are comics. There's a story here. There's a story that there were some deer and there were some dudes with arrows, and they shot the deer. And it's very easy to turn this into comics by just adding word bubbles. So the takeaway here is that we've been telling stories with pictures for a long time. Before we even had words, we were telling stories with pictures. And adding words to that, hey presto, you've got comics. So comics are good. This is a comic called The Yellow Kid, not as racist as it sounds. It's from 1900, around that time. It's one of the first American comics. It's so early, it predates the invention, the American invention, the North American invention, I should say, of the word balloon. And so the Yellow Kid talks through his shirt. It's blank here, and when he wants to say something, the words in his shirt magically change into what he's saying. Really surreal. In this one he's saying, he goes into a paint store, he chases a kid into the paint store. He comes out saying, "Ah, gee, you ought to see the uttered kid say I didn't do a thing to him." There's your punchline. So, like, comedy has changed, but what I want you to see here is that this was a newspaper strip, and it's huge. I mean, it's projected huge, but it's also printed large in the paper, and it's in full color. Comics were a really big deal at the time. And the Yellow Kid was the Mickey Mouse of his day. He was super merchandised on like snuff boxes and corsets and other like 19th century merchandise. And he was really popular. Another comic from the same time period is Little Nemo in Slumberland. This is small. I don't expect you to read the text. But look at what's happening. The kid's having a dream. He wakes up. And his bed starts going crazy. And as the bed gets crazier, the panels get taller and taller to accommodate what's going on with the bed. This is really inventive stuff, especially for 1911, when you just invented the word bubble. And you're already playing with what's going on with the panel layout. So comics in newspapers were doing really neat stuff. And again, this is a full page of newsprint, printed in full color. They could afford to do this. And the reason they could afford to do this was that it made them money. So we're going to go to like 1920. And at this time, there's more than one paper per city. In fact, there's several papers per major metropolitan areas. You have competing newspapers. And so let's say a house burns down. You want to read about this awesome house that burned down. You have 6 or 7 papers to choose from. They're all going to cover the same story. The news is the news. What differentiates papers at the time is the comics section. If you want to read about this wacky bed, you have to buy the newspaper that has Little Nemo and Slumberland in it. If you want to follow a strip, you have to keep buying that paper. So comics become this differentiating aspect that sell papers. And that's why they're being printed in full color and being able to afford to do this really awesome stuff. Look at this guy. You might recognize him. William Randolph Hearst. Citizen Kane is based on this guy. He was super pissed about that. He's the kind of guy who, when Citizen Kane comes out, tries to buy up all the prints and burn them so that no one ever sees the movie. He solves his problems with business. And he's a newspaper man, and he's running a newspaper in New York called the New York Journal-American. And he's being clobbered, this is around 1920, by another newspaper called the New York World, which prints the yellow kid, which we saw earlier, the not racist, wacky yellow guy who reads dialogue off his shirt. So what he does, he solves his problem with money and buys the cartoonist, a guy named Outcalt, brings him over to his paper. What he can't buy is the actual strip or the character. So in his paper, he starts printing Yellow Kid comics done by the original artist. And in the old paper, the one the artist used to work at, they're still printing Yellow Kid comics, now done by a new cartoonist. So there's 2 papers in the same city, both printing Yellow Kid comics. And they're both winning with this because the public loves Yellow Kid so much. And what's interesting, this is an aside, a linguistic aside, but it's really cool. At the time, there's 2 papers selling Yellow Kid comics in them. They get known as the Yellow Kid papers. And the style of journalism they did was this sort of sensationalist, rapes and murders on the front page, explosions, that sort of newspaper. That got known as Yellow Kid journalism, which gets compressed into yellow journalism, which is where that phrase comes from. Comics are everywhere. So William Randolph Hearst buys the artist, and it turns out the comics by the original artist are more popular, but he's a businessman who's like, it'd be really great if there weren't a second Yellow Kid strip, if I could just own the comic. Because then no one would buy the New York World, they'd all buy my paper. And so he invents an industry that does this for him, and that's called syndication. And syndication is crazy. In every other field of human endeavor, almost without exception, syndicates are evil. Batman fights the oil syndicate, and there's crime syndicates, but in comics, syndicates are a good thing. For a while. And the way they work is that a syndicate comes up and says, okay, I'm an organization, I'm going to buy comics from cartoonists outright. Ryan, I'm going to buy dinosaur comics, I'm going to give you a salary. You get paid to do the comics, you're happy, you don't have to deal with papers anymore, we'll do that for you. So I say, sure, have T-Rex for the rest of your lives, I'll take my paycheck, because I'm a starving cartoonist in 1920. The papers get a good deal because they no longer have to deal with 8 different cartoonists. They deal with one syndicate who gives them content that they can actually buy exclusive rights for. So they can own Yellow Kid for all of New York or whatever range they're willing to pay for. So they get content that differentiates their paper and that lets them bring in readers. So they're happy. Syndicates are super happy because they own these strips and they can merchandise. So they're selling all these Yellow Kid T-shirts with words printed on them and things like that. And so within a very short period of time, syndicates are running the show. The only stuff that's not syndicated is local strips, political strips that are very regional. They don't have a broad range. Everything else is going through a syndicate like King Features, which William Randolph Hearst came up with out of his mind. And so let's jump to like 1950, where this is where syndicates start to be really bad for the medium because papers have all started to merge. And in a major city, you've only got one paper. And if a house burns down, you want to read about the awesome fire, you've only got one paper to turn to. So comics are no longer important for circulation wars. They're just there. And the papers are paying for them. Why are they going to print 16 pages of full color for something that's not that important? Comics start to shrink. They start going to these tiny boxes printed in black and white, and you don't see the stuff we saw before, which was this inventive new form of, hey, let's invent word bubbles and crazy panels. You start getting boxes in prescribed shapes, and the medium starts to choke itself. And it's not all bad. I'm worried that I'm going to say newspaper strips are uniformly terrible. It's not true. And the whole reason I have slides here was for this strip I want to show you. Right here. It's Peanuts. This is from 1951. And I grew up, like most of you guys. When you looked at the newspaper page, there's really not much there that's entertaining. It's the same sort of bland sort of jokes. And Peanuts wasn't that great. It was Charles Schulz at the end of his career. But he was super awesome near the beginning and for a long time after that, which surprised me. I thought Peanuts wasn't that great. This comic I read in a bookstore. I laughed out loud at a bookstore, which never happens because it's embarrassing. So panel 1, it's larger than me. You can probably read it. Charlie Brown has been waiting all year to pull this joke on Patty. There's Patty. He says, hey, Patty, there's a spider on your back. Patty says, brush it off quick. Charlie Brown, April Fool, ha, 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 ho, what a joke, ho, ho, ho. She says April Fool's Day was yesterday. In the last panel, Charlie Brown is super pissed. Like, that's fresh today. He's got an anger line around his head. I've never seen Charlie Brown emote so much. He's raging. So you can do good stuff in a constrained medium, but it gets harder. And let's jump ahead to around 1980, 1990, where you've been doing these boxes for so long. The newspaper strip has comics like Garfield, Marmaduke, High and Lois, Hager the Horrible. Are there any Hager the Horrible fans here or Marmaduke fans? A few. So these strips all share a very similar sense of humor that appeal to a similar audience. And you're not seeing more inventive stuff, more crazy stuff on the comics page, which is what I think starts to kill the medium. Because the average person, when they think about comics in, say, 1990, the non-comics fan is going to think of what they've already seen, which is going to be this. Superheroes, newspaper strips, and Archie. Nothing against Jughead. He's a good guy. Nothing against superheroes. I love Batman, and that's a big claim to make in a room full of computer guys. But I think he's the best superhero. Superman's not bad himself. But this is all comics is to lots of people around 1990, because that's all they know. Comics is in the ghetto. If you want to buy comics, you have to go to a comic shop. In the comic shop, it's mostly going to be superheroes anyway. So it's like if in 1950 we all decided that the only movies we're going to make are romantic comedies. And so for the next 50 years, you go to a multiplex and you just see romantic comedies. And you can't fault the person who walks out of a multiplex 50 years later and says, you know what, I don't think I like movies. Because it's all romantic comedies, and that's all they know. And people say, I don't like comics, because they think it's superheroes, newspaper strips, and Archie. But it's not. It's a medium. These are genres. This is what kills me. You walk into a bookstore, and it's changing, but most bookstores sort their material by genre. You have romance novels, adventure books, cookbooks, and then if they have comics at all, it's in a separate section. But it doesn't make any sense. You can have adventure comics, you can have romance comics, you can have cookbook comics. Why are they all together? Why don't you have cookbook comics with the rest of the cookbooks? This is the ghetto. You can't stumble across comics unless you're looking for them, unless you walk into the bookstore and say, yes, I'm here for a graphic novel. You're not going to find them. That's what's killing the medium, or what was killing the medium until webcomics come along. And here's the thesis statement. Webcomics let you stumble across a comic. You can browse the web and find a comic and say, hey, this is pretty cool. Your friends send you links. You're like, oh, that's a funny comic. I enjoy that. I've gotten so many emails from people who say, Ryan, I don't like comics, but I like yours. And I always want to say, like, surprise, you like comics. It's all comics. It's dinosaur comics in the title. So newspapers are changing, and I'm sure in 15 years, my utopia 15 years, but I think it's going to come true, people won't be reading comics in the way they are now. They won't be reading them in the standard newspaper page. And so the only people reading Garfield in 15 years will be people who really like Garfield. And that's fantastic, because it won't be everyone reading Garfield who hates Garfield and thinks comics sucks because Garfield sucks. Garfield's not going to be the ambassador for comics anymore, nor Archie or Betty or Veronica or those two background characters who are probably nice people. So that's the short history lesson, which brings us to webcomics, which brings us to me, which brings us to my very first comic I ever made. It's terrible. I know you're going to be reading the text while I talk, but honestly, don't bother. I decided I wanted to do a comic. I sat down with this ancient dinosaur clip art package I had, and I laid out some panels. And I thought, okay, characters are good. I'll have this character in the first two panels, and then a new character, and then another new character, and then a fourth new character, and then they start disappearing as the panels go on. And I started to write, and you can see halfway through panel 5, this is where I gave up, flipped the table, left the room, and said, comics suck. What was I thinking? But I came back to it, and I thought, okay, this isn't working. What's not working? It's that green dinosaur. Replace him with the second green dinosaur. Suddenly I have a layout that works. And this is the second comic I ever wrote. And this is the first one on the website, if you look at it. And honestly, this is not the best comic either. I'm basically talking off the top of my head. There's no clear punchline. The last words are crazy U-Traptor. I had to look up into the clipart program what this dinosaur was called. And I was like, U-Traptor, that sounds funny. There's my punchline. But I sat down when I did this, and I did about 15 comics in the same sitting to see if this idea I had of a comic where the pictures don't change was possible. And it turns out it was, which was lucky because my first idea that I rejected was a comic where the story never changes, the dialogue doesn't change, but the pictures do. Which is a really cool idea if you know how to draw, and I was not that person. So I sort of had to abandon that and switch to this. And so I started this comic, and initially it was like me and my friends reading it, and my friends got bored, so it was me reading it. And it took about 2 years of doing this comic before anything really happened with it, which was fine, because I didn't even know stuff could happen with comics when I was doing this. I didn't know about any other online comics besides Achewood. I thought I was being super inventive by having a dinosaur in my comic. No one's done that before. And after about 2 years, there's sort of this critical mass. People were linking to it enough that I started getting emails from strangers, which is fantastic. It's the best way to start your day when you wake up and there's an email from someone you don't know saying, hey, Ryan, I love your comic, and therefore, by extension, I love you. It's amazing. And it's sweet. And you write back saying, thanks. And I mean, I'm talking about all the good stuff. There's been some bad stuff, too. I'm not sure if I should say this because I think it's being recorded. But early on, I used to sell dinosaur panties. This being the gesture for panties, I guess. And so I never really saw my readers. I was saying, hey, send me pictures, send me pictures. I also sold shirts, and I was expecting to get pictures of shirts. But I got this picture of someone wearing my panties, except it was shot from like here to here. And so I sent this around to one of my friends saying, hey, this is awesome. Look at this shot I got. It's someone wearing the panties I had produced. And this guy wrote back and said, that's neat, Ryan. How old did she say she was? And it was really hard to tell. But it's also really hard to write back to a stranger who just sent you a shot of her underwear and say, how old are you? Without sounding super creepy. So my solution was to write her back and say, hey, awesome picture. How did you take it? Hoping she'd say, like, my boyfriend took it or my legal guardian, or I'd have some clue with the response. But she said I took it in the mirror with a camera, and I was like, okay, thanks. And then I deleted the picture just in case. And now I just tell people about it. So the write-up for this promised some stories of regret, and I've really only got one. But this was about the third year where I started having more readership, and I won an award. And it was this award for Best Furry Comic. So I learned a lot about the furry community very quickly. And it turns out there's a schism in the, or at least there was. I haven't checked into it lately. But dinosaurs had scales or feathers. They didn't have fur. And there was a split between the furries and the scalies. And this guy who I encountered was a scaly, and he was super pissed that a comic with dinosaurs was Best Furry Comic because it wasn't a furry comic. And he had this huge live journal rant about it. And you ask any online cartoonist who's going to tell you the truth, they will admit that they Google their own names once in a while. I Googled my own name and found this. And this is where the regret comes in. I thought, you know what? I've been a nice guy for a long time. Maybe not today. So I sent him a one-sentence email that just said, hey, sorry you don't like my awesome comic. Total antagonistic thing. And I think he wrote back, like, raging on me, and, like, he had a lot of fury. And I felt bad and didn't write back, and I thought, you know, what was I expecting? I'm antagonizing a stranger with my awesome comic. But the nice coda of this, I felt bad, and there's the regret, but the nice coda is that about 6 months later, he emailed me saying, hey, you know, I want to apologize. I've had a lot of rage, and I'm getting counseling, and I wanted to apologize for being so mean to you. And I was like, dude, I was the jerk here. Like, I'm the guy with the snappy line in his email to piss you off. So I apologized to him, and we made peace, and life went on. Happy ending. Which was nice. I mean, it's nice to have a happy ending when you piss off a stranger on the internet. The other thing that I promised was talking about how being a cartoonist can get you in trouble with your thesis supervisor, which happened to me. Because I don't know if anyone here is a writer or a cartoonist or writes creative stuff, but sometime in the 1970s, people started saying, write what you know, and it slid into you can only write what you know in the public perception. So people assume there's an equal sign here between T-Rex and me. And it's not always true, but this, where I'm terrible, sometimes it's true, and I cheat. So people who know me a little bit can recognize sometimes stuff happens to T-Rex that has also happened to me, and they reasonably conclude that this is pure autobiography, and everything that happens to T-Rex is something I did the day before. Normally it's not a problem, but I did a comic where a T-Rex had a threesome. Something I've never done. And the next day I had a meeting with my thesis supervisor. It wasn't, she didn't call me in. It was a scheduled meeting. And she's like, hey, Ryan, I read your comic because it was printed in the school paper. And she left it there like I'm supposed to jump in and say, yes, interesting, let me tell you about it. So we had this awkward conversation where I sort of tried to say it wasn't autobiographical without implying that I thought that she thought I had some crazy sex the night before. So, I mean, this is crazy, this autobiographical thing. My friend Joey does a comic called The Softer World. He wrote a novel about this angry, queer-identified youth who goes around and smashes shit up. And he was interviewed on CBC about it, which is our national broadcaster way up north. And they were saying, wow, this is a really good book. And how much shit did you smash while you were writing this? And he had this really good response. I was like, you know what, it's fiction. I can write science fiction. I can write a story about going to the moon, but I've never been there. Make stuff up. So please remember that artists and writers and cartoonists make stuff up, but we also cheat and do autobiography. And so read into it all you want, because I have no defense for any of that. I also want to mention, so I started with saying comics are saving the medium, but we're also doing good work too. XKCD is building that school, which is fantastic. Underneath my comic and a bunch of others, we have links to distributed computing processes, or programs rather, that let you donate your spare cycles to cancer research, things like that. I did a comic once about 2 years ago. It was a comic about this disease, which the reason I did a comic about disease was that it's this crazy disease that really sounds like it shouldn't exist and is a disease a 2-year-old would make up, where your connective tissue over time turns to bone, and you end up being unable to move. You're a human statue. Crazy, but it affects real people. And I thought, this is really interesting, but I don't want to make a comic about a terminal disease with a punchline at the end. That feels kind of wrong. So I did a comic that I was happy with and sort of showed what was going on and how it affected people, and there was a joke at the end that I thought was tasteful. But I thought, you know what? I make money by selling T-shirts. I'm going to be profiting off of a joke of a disease. I'm not comfortable with that. So I put a note saying, anyone who buys a shirt today, I'm giving you all the money to this organization that helps people with FOP, which I think is fibrosifacans, ossificans progressiva, bones progressing, turned into a human statue sort of thing. I thought that was the end of it, but I got this email from a guy who was his niece actually had the disease. And he was really touched that I had written a comic about it and told people about it and was donating the money I made towards the group that helps people with this disease. And it's very rare. There's, I think, 30 cases in North America, so it was very directly helping his niece. And I wasn't expecting such a personal email, such emotion there. So I took like 2 days to write back to it, and I finally said, I don't know how to write this, but I'm glad you appreciate it, and it affected me too. And I hope things get better. And then 2 years later, I met him at a show. And again, was this really, like at a show, you're telling stories, you're having a fun time. And this guy's also having fun time, but you have this relationship where you both have sort of shared this very personal email moment. So there's no real ending to the story except that sometimes emails can make you feel funny, and you get a lot of emails when you're a cartoonist. The end. There's something I want to say here. Are there any questions so far about anything I've spoken about? Yeah. Yeah. Right. For those who don't know, the Comics Code started in the 1950s in response to the really violent graphic comics that were being produced in magazines. Stuff like EC Comics typically had someone's eye being threatened on the cover, knives going towards eyes, hooks near eyes, that sort of thing, marketed to kids. So they made this Comics Code that had in it no damage to eyes allowed in comics. Also stuff, very 50s stuff, like police have to be respected, the law's always right, stuff like that, which sort of crippled Batman for 30 years. He's a vigilante, but the police are always right. So I came out of that with some interesting comics. I don't think superheroes are really responsible for what happened in North America to comics. I think they were violent stuff being marketed to kids, and they shifted towards more happy-go-lucky fare marketed towards kids. But that wasn't really what was hurting the medium in the general view, because people who read superhero comics usually like comics and they have to seek them out. The general public's view of superheroes is Batman's a guy in tights with mummy issues, and Superman's a guy in tights with a lot of power, and that's pretty much where it ends until the movies came out. And you learn more about Batman. I touched on this before briefly. I want to talk about how people on the internet make money. It's mostly through selling T-shirts, which is kind of crazy to explain it to your parents, because you have to say, all right, Mom and Dad, I've done this degree in computational linguistics. I spent 2 years in higher education after 4 years of undergrad and all this high school, and I decided I'm not going to use my education but going to do comics on the internet that I will give away for free and somehow make money. And it turns out you can. It turns out people will buy shirts. When I started the comic, I had to sell 3 shirts a day to stay off the street and keep up my fabulous student lifestyle of macaroni and cheese for lunch and that sort of thing. And I could, which was crazy. Like I remember once I went full-time as a cartoonist, this one shower I had, where I was sitting in the shower, standing in the shower, and trying to imagine 3 people a day needing a shirt for me. And I'm like, this is not going to happen. Like, no, there's not that many people who need shirts from me. But it turns out there are, and I'm so thankful for that because it lets me be this cartoonist. Which, I mean, the thing with cartooning is that it's a really lonely job. Internet cartooning, less so because you've got Twitter and you can talk to your friends online. You feel connected, but at the end of the day, you're basically doing a movie, a storyboard, but it's just you doing the writing and the art and the character design and the plot and everything. For me, I feel like kind of a fraud because I just have to write it and lay it out. And so it takes me about 3 hours a day to write a comic. But then I'm done. And so while 3 hours seems like a lot for 6 panels and maybe 200 words, I don't have to spend 8 hours drawing it. So if you're going to be a cartoonist, prepare to be alone a lot and get good at drawing or find a way around it. Once I started being full-time, I graduated. I thought I'm going to be a cartoonist. That just means I have this choice of getting a real job or being a cartoonist. I'll go for the comics. But I was kind of done my day at noon. I would get up, write the comic, upload it, and then check your email, and then you're done. And for anyone who's had free time like this, the first 2 weeks is super awesome. You're like, yeah, spring break, do whatever I want, woo! But then after 2 weeks, you're sitting in front of your computer and you're refreshing your email, and there's no new email, and you find yourself hitting the refresh button again. Nothing else to do, and you start feeling like you're wasting your life and you're not doing anything. And it sort of starts to kill you on the inside. So I started doing these other projects. I wrote a search engine for comics that relies on user transcriptions, sort of crowdsource a transcription, bring it all in. You can search the dialogue inside comics, which OCR isn't there yet, especially for things. My comic's easy because I use a computer font, but there's hand font, there's explosion sound effects that are integrated into the image. So crowdsourcing it out works really well, and that was Oh No Robot. And then I wrote a site to make RSS easier that I called RSSPECT. Find out what it means to me. And then I wrote a online advertising company called Project Wonderful that tries to make online advertising more awesome and less terrible. And so this is sort of how you fill up your time. You have time to do the stuff that you're interested in while not having to go to a job, which is fantastic. You can do whatever you want. And the nice thing is, you don't have to use your degree. I never studied comics, and here I am talking about them. I studied computer science, and I do it sort of in my spare time as a fun sort of thing. Don't worry if you graduate and you don't use your degree. I think that happens a lot of the time. Less so with computer science, more so with liberal arts. But it happens, and it's not a bad thing. I shouldn't diss liberal arts, because that's what I do as a career now. I want to talk about community, too. There's a really great community online of people who are nice, which really surprised me when I started the comic. Because you have this idea of the internet being, exploding white vans, 4chan, people being mean to each other, because it's hilarious. And I was bracing myself for hate mail, because this is a comic where the pictures don't change. It's kind of an aggressive aesthetic. I don't draw. I'm not really a cartoonist. But I get like 5 hate mails total over 5 years, about a hate mail a year. So the rest is just nice people. And when you're getting 1 hate mail a year, it's super hilarious because you can write back to the guy and sort of egg him on. So I guess I'm just realizing I'm the guy who's the dick on the internet trying to... Whoops. I'm going to get some water. Are there any questions on what I said so far? Yeah?
Yeah, where do you spend your time online?
How do I spend my time online?
Yeah.
Poorly. I start my day by going to Reddit and looking at the front page and the pics subreddit and the WTF subreddit. And then I usually read comics, 1 or 2. I started to switch that until after I've written my comic, because I read comics and I'm like, these are really good. I'm a fraud. What am I doing? I can't write. So I'll write my comic and then I'll go read better comics. And then the rest of it's just like browsing. My girlfriend sends me, the wacky links, the boy in the balloon type stuff. So I keep on top of that. And yeah, there's no real, nothing that interesting. I wish I had better stories. Like there's a secret porn site that only cartoonists go to. And you won't believe it. What's interesting, you remind me of this, is it's really weird when you meet someone who's a cartoonist or someone you admire. Comics especially, because say I'm a huge fan of, I need a comic. Sorry? That's what I was going for actually. I'm a huge fan of questionable content. And I meet Jeff, the cartoonist, and I've met him at a con. This was the exact experience where I liked his comic, and I was pretty sure I liked him because of it, and I couldn't tease them apart. So you meet Jeff, and you're like, I really like you, Jeff. More than I should. Like, what's going on here? So it's tricky to tease apart the creator and the cartoon, or the comic. And that's extended to like so many email relationships where I email someone whose comic I like, and it's really hard not to feel like there's something going on between us already. Yeah?
Speaking of your relationship with other webcomic artists, you used to have, I know that you worked on a project, I forget the name of it.
Whispered apologies?
Yes. Is there any possibility that will ever be?
So here's where I committed the cardinal sin of a web cartoonist, where you put a comic up and then you stop updating it and never tell anyone. When I first came full-time, I had all this extra free time, and I thought I'd start a second comic, which I called Whispered Apologies. And that was this comic where, again, I can't draw, but I had a new solution where I'd get artists to submit comic pages with word bubbles, but with no words inside. And then me and a few other writers would fill in the words. It was this collaboration between different areas with no really knowing what the result would look like. And some of it was really awesome, some of it was not so great. But it took up just too much of my time. I ended up spending, another 3 hours a day writing this comic, and I felt like I'm not a good enough writer to be doing it just yet. So I'm hoping to bring it back at some point, but it's really just a matter of time, and that I don't have any to do it. Yeah. Yeah, that can be awkward sometimes, especially since for the longest time, and it was honestly more on the print side than the web side, there was this conflict between print and web, where the print guys said, web comics aren't really comics, you're just glorified t-shirt salesmen, you're not a cartoonist, you're a fraud, we do the real stuff. And the web guys said, you're just a Garfield stuck in the window salesman, and we're all doing the comics anyway. So there is this sort of conflict, but it's less so now. And really, I mean, whether it's print or web, we're all doing comics. It's the same thing. It's just a different medium. So I don't feel like there's any intrinsic conflict between us. There may be a cultural conflict, especially since our model is put the comic up for free and get paid if someone wants to buy something from you. Well, the old syndicate model is you get a job and you get a paycheck from the syndicate, and you have a job. You get paid on a regular basis. You're not relying on someone running out of shirts today, at least 3 people to be topless for you to stay off the street. Yeah? Yeah. I had a message board. I still do. But it started out as this really nice, friendly community. And then as time went on, this is, I think, 2003 when I started the comic, and 2004, 2005. Around 2006, it started getting kind of mean. And when new people joined, they'd get insulted and torn apart, and they'd leave. And I felt really bad because they were following a link from my website to say, here's a wacky forum to talk about comics, and they're getting chewed out by jerks on the internet. And I couldn't figure out where it went wrong, how my kid had grown up to be so angry. But if I would do it again, I'd moderate it more. I had never moderated anything, and so it just evolved in its own way. And all it took was one clique of people to sort of dominate, even just as a joke, but to become ironically mean. And then by 2007, the irony starts to fade away, and it just sort of becomes mean. And it's shifted. I mean, it's better now, and I'm sure there'll be people on the forum who find out about this and be like, Ryan, you jerk. We're not all jerks. But if I were starting an online community, I would try to at least influence the tenor of the conversation so that you don't end up with a place where you don't feel comfortable sending new people. Lesson learned. Yeah. Right. I don't really have much experience there. I know in Japan, comics had a parallel and different evolution where they don't have this stigma as being kid stuff, and you can tell an adult story in a comic and not raise eyebrows, unless it's like a really adult story. But in that case, I don't think that webcomics are helping it that much. People already accept the medium and know that it is a medium, not a genre. Well, with North America, there's still this sort of stigma. Comics are for kids, and they're all superheroes or fat cats who don't like Mondays but love lasagna. Yeah. That's a good question. And the answer is no. I've had this image for... The question was, are you sick of these pictures yet? And the answer is no. I've had these pictures for almost, I guess, over 6 years now. And I told you when I started I did 15 all at once. That was because I wasn't sure this was possible, because you have these static images, and how can you tell the same story about a dinosaur stepping in a house, stepping on a tiny woman? There's a tiny woman here. People miss that a lot. I get emails being like, hey, there's a woman in the strip. I had no idea. Talking to another dinosaur and then shouting something after him while looking like he needs to go to the bathroom. But the images are really, really surprisingly malleable. If you add a header above the second panel that says, meanwhile, on a parallel Earth, you've changed the entire visual narrative of the strip. If this says 6 months earlier above panel 5, it's not telling the same story visually. And so I can flex it a lot. And I also have this great advantage where I get up in the morning and I'm not facing a blank sheet of paper. I know that I'm going to write a comic. It's probably going to have a green T-Rex in it at some point. So I have toys to play with. I can move them around, and I can make T-Rex say different things and have Jimmy talk or not talk, depending on how verbose T-Rex is. So it's really surprised me how flexible they were. The other interesting thing is that their personalities really came out from the drawings, which I guess makes sense. They're stuck in these positions. But T-Rex looks super excitable in panel 2. Kind of a super excitable guy. Ute-Raptor looks kind of stern and skeptical. He's kind of that guy. I want to go back to the first dinosaur comic here, where you can see, maybe you can't see it that clearly, but there's just a few pixels different. It totally ruins the strip. He looks like a frog. I don't understand it. This strip would not have worked, so I'm glad I changed it. Yeah? Right. This is kind of a variant on the where do you get your ideas question, which is a good question, and it gets a bad rap. I get emails from people who are saying, well, clearly you have a degree in psychology, or clearly you studied philosophy. And I haven't, and I feel like a fraud because if I'm doing a comic about some topic, I'm going to research it for a couple hours beforehand so I know enough to talk about without making an ass of myself and have a joke at the end. And that's really all I do. So when I'm writing about some really cool thing, most of the time I've just found out about it. And I'm trying to play myself off like the expert on the internet. But where I find out about these things, it's from friends. It's sometimes just reading a bunch of stuff. I have a list of a flat text file where I keep things I wanted to look into or phrases I've remembered and thought I could do something with. Funny stuff my friends have said that I can steal, that sort of thing. So everywhere. Really it's just from keeping your ears open and your eyes open. I guess you can't close your ears, but listening and looking and trying to asking strangers or people you've just met what's the most interesting thing they've learned from whatever they've studied is a great way to find out really cool stuff. Because people know a lot of interesting things that's unique to their domain that you don't know as a computer scientist or as a linguist or anything else like that. So I guess the short version's everywhere, but the longer version is hopefully a little bit more satisfying. Yeah?
What webcomics do you use
Okay, tons. And I used to have trouble with this because I feel like I have to name all the comics that I read, also insult people. But now I understand that webcomics, web cartoonists are kind of this laid-back group, and I can meet Jeff from Questionable Content and be like, hey, I haven't read your strip for 6 months, and he won't be pissed off because we're all busy guys. My favorite ones for the most recent little while are one called Nedroid. It's about this potato and a orangey bird, purple bird thing called Reginald. It sounds terrible, but my strip sounds terrible too on the surface. And Nedroid's really about friendship. These two guys who hang out and have really fun times together. And it's sweet and heartwarming, but hilarious and awesome. Another one I really like is called MS Paint Adventures. It's this strip where it sort of takes the form of an adventure game, and the commands are user-submitted. So insane stuff happens, but he keeps it in this self-contained universe that builds up really nicely, and that is surreal and hilarious and blows my mind. Those are actually the two comics I don't read until I've done reading my comic. So I read them first. I just go back to bed and like I can't beat this. Not that it's a competition. We're all just trying to tell jokes.
Do you have to pay royalties on the clip art?
Royalty-free. Which is good, because I've used that clip art a lot. And it's actually, it came from this pack where they were dinosaur clip art parts. So it's like dinosaur arm, T-Rex leg. I could pose them a bit. So in theory, I could make all these different poses. But these are default poses, the demo poses from the software. I feel like I got really lucky with this layout because I had no idea what I was doing. And I ended up with a layout. I should switch to the real one, but I ended up with a layout that works for storytelling and that I didn't make too many major errors with. I mean, the biggest one is that they're standing on the bottom of the panel, which is what you do when you're 2, is not what you're supposed to do when you're a cartoonist. Like, it implies that the ground is a black line, but it works because there's no background, the dialogue is a black line, it's sort of this weird black line universe. So I got away. I got a lot of luck with what I came up with. You can see by the second panel, I forgot that they're not supposed to step on the ground, and they do it for the rest of the strip. Terrible. Yeah.
How do you feel that webcomics are influencing the direction of comics in general? Like you were saying that basically in order to support yourself on the internet, you have to be able to sell t-shirts. And the only thing I see that are t-shirts, I bought several of your t-shirts.
Thank you.
Funny, wacky, humorous punchline script.
Right.
You don't see a lot of long-form drama or really experimental stuff that fits on a t-shirt.
That's true. And that actually is kind of the biggest stumbling block. If you're telling a long-form story, it's hard to sort of shoehorn that into the web. A great example is Meredith's Octopus Pie. It's this long-form story comic that takes place in Brooklyn. And she used to do these daily updates, but she felt like every day there needs to be a punchline or something that brings you back. And so she recently switched to doing, I think every 3 weeks, you get a clump of comics. And then another clump 3 weeks later, so you can have beats, you can have moments of quiet solitude that you're not going to get in dinosaur comics at all. And she actually does sell t-shirts. But you're right, there is an issue where if you're doing a strip that doesn't lend itself to a slogan or a picture on a shirt, it's more difficult to support yourself. It's not impossible. You can do book sales, advertising. I know Jorge does PhD comics. He does a lot of tours and a lot of speaking engagements, and that's how he makes most of his money, which blew my mind. I was having dinner with him, and I was like, you don't sell much shirts? Like, what do you do? You can talk? At the back? That's awesome. First time that happened, I really had a problem with it. I'm serious, because it was... I kept thinking of Mickey Mouse and Disney, and if you get a Mickey Mouse tattoo on your chest, you have a guarantee that's almost perfect that the Disney Corporation is not going to make Mickey Mouse a racist homophobe in his next adventure. But I could do this. It's a huge amount of trust between the person who got the tattoo and me that for the rest of the life of the strip, I'm not going to put something up that he disagrees with that makes him feel shame about his body. And that's a huge amount of trust. So this is why T-Rex has not been a racist, homophobe bastard, because there's people with tattoos, and I got to respect their ink. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite one of your strips that stands out from all those?
Yeah, I was going to put it up, but I thought that would be egotistical to say, here's my favorite strip that I wrote. But I should have, because it was a very helpful question. It's about 6 months in, and this is, again, embarrassing. 6 months with this layout, and only 6 months and a day did I realize that I could have someone speaking off-panel with a dialogue line coming from here instead of from here. And you could have off-panel characters. And this was a revelation. The first one I had was God. And it was a strip where T-Rex was on the search for God. He's looking for him under the couch, behind the fridge. Your chapter says you're looking for God the person. You want to look for God the idea, love, truth, that sort of thing. And then the last panel is T-Rex saying, oh, there you are, and God saying, I was going to surprise you behind the couch. And only after I wrote it, I say, wait a minute, I didn't have to show God. I just added a new character to my strip. This is amazing. And then I added the devil, which sort of flowed easily. Have T-Rex has some really sinister neighbors, some raccoons and cephalopods. And this is a funny story. The cephalopods are really creepy neighbors. And in their first appearance, they're trying to get T-Rex to come over. And the last line is, come on, T-Rex, come over, come bleed with us. Just super creepy. But I didn't write that line. A friend of mine was doing community radio, and Friday nights, twice a month, 4 times a month, every Friday night there was a show after hers that was called the Lunar Power Hour. That was a radio show about menstruation. And she sent me one of the pamphlets they had, and they had a hut at an event where I guess you went in the hut and you had group menstruation. And the slogan was, come bleed with us. And I was like, this is gold. I'm going to put this in my comic. So where do ideas come from? Menstruation pamphlets.
Character of God. You had one comic where T-Rex and Mutarefter are arguing that there are only so many songs that can ever be written.
Right.
These additions of, I've actually noticed of these, God has kind of showed up more and more in the comics. And I was just wondering if that is you need an extra place.
Like I was running out of stuff.
Yeah,
just
like
T-Rex.
it's an extra variable to add to make it so you have more possible.
Right, I've increased my combinatorial explosion. It's a little of that, but it's really, I guess it is kind of that. But the main role God plays from a structural point of view is that in the first 2 panels, it gives T-Rex someone to bounce off of, which was really kind of a revelation where I'm like, he can talk to someone when he's alone on the panel. I can do different stuff in the first 2 panels. So God shows up because of that. It gives T-Rex someone to talk to. But also, I really like the character. I like how he is... Only T-Rex can hear him, which raises a lot of issues. But he's this creator in the strip of everything, from T-Rex's point of view, I guess. But T-Rex is kind of atheist, and it doesn't make sense to be hearing God and accepting it without any question. And God doesn't really care about religion. He's just there to have a good time. So I like that God. And I got a few emails from priests and pastors saying, hey, I like your comic. I like how it's not obnoxious towards religion. And I really like that because I'm like, I'm glad you feel that way, because I'm trying not to be purposely obnoxious towards anyone, but I'm glad my imaginary God is not offensive towards priests. that made me feel good. Yeah.
A couple months back where it was the Read Your Own Adventure, and it was the gift where they changed. How did you come up with that, and how long did it take you to write it?
That totally wasn't me. That was I had a guest week, and Andrew Husty, who does MS Paint Adventures, did this. And what it was, and I was kicking myself because I never thought of this in 5 years, was it was an animated file where every few seconds one of the panels would flip to different dialogue. So depending on how fast you read the strip, you'd get a different comic. And I think when they're all laid out, there were like 64 different panels, which gave you all these different comics depending on how fast you read. It was crazy and insane, and I wish I thought of it, because it made for really surreal reading and a new form of comics that is not really functional, but kind of cool. And I got some angry emails, people being like, I can't read all the strips. I want to read them all, but there's too many. Please stop doing this. At the back? T-Rex is Lonely is a strip that, for a couple years, people have been sort of remixing the comic, and I have this advantage where the panels are locked, so you can do some cool things with that. Early on, someone took headlines and put them into a dinosaur comic, so you could read the news in comic form, but a really weird comic where they complete each other's sentences. T-Rex is Lonely is a strip where it's the first panel, the second panel, and the last panel, so it's only T-Rex talking to himself. And that's I see it as this amazing compliment where someone cares enough about the comic to start remixing it and doing cool things with it and doing their own comics where it's just insane stuff happening. There was one a few months ago where someone took panel 2, where T-Rex is typically reacting to something he said, and replaced panel 1 with a random Twitter post. And it worked really well. So stuff like that I think is fabulous. Like, that's hilarious, and I'm really happy to see it. I saw a question over there. Oh, there it is, sorry. Sorry, what? No, I don't know it. What's it do? Right, I've seen a few sites like that where you can sort of drop in characters and make them speak and sort of build your own comic without having to draw. They've never really appealed to me, which sounds odd because that's basically what I'm doing, is taking someone else's character and putting words on top. But they seemed kind of lifeless. And maybe that's just prejudice for me, being like, I do it better. But it felt like when you're using these sort of stock characters, and everyone else is also using the same characters, it's hard to tell your own story when in one comic, your character might be a sad guy with a lot of feelings, and in someone else's parallel comic, he might be a racist homophobe. It's hard to reconcile those two when you've read them both. Just a purely creative point of view. Yeah.
Is there any hope for every article in the universe, or every subject in the universe except chickens? Or is that...
So the question was, there was a comic a couple years ago where T-Rex solved the Wikipedia problem, where he's like, you know what, there's a lot of vandalism on Wikipedia. Here's the solution. We all agree to just vandalize the chickens article. Because dudes already know about chickens. We don't need that article. The rest of the encyclopedia is safe. And I wrote up this comic, and I thought, that's a really good idea. So I registered every topic in the universe except chickens.com and wrote this huge manifesto with like block letters and big caps talking about how it was supported by fictional Jimbo Wales. He's a big fan. And then linked the chickens article with the comic. It's a bad idea. I've done this a couple times. I did a comic where, this was based on real life, where I found out that if you took an essay about evil, which my brother had written in high school, or this essay about how evil is in all of us and you can have good without evil and all this sort of stuff. And I snuck into his room and did replace all evil with the phrase Irish evil. And suddenly he has this article, Kenny in something that says, "Can good exist without Irish evil?" Some philosophers think you can't. There's Irish evil in all of us. It was really hilarious. And so the comic about this, so they changed it to Wikipedia's article, and then I linked to the version I vandalized that had Irish evil there. And I felt bad because people kept re-vandalizing it. And I got these angry emails from Wikipedia editors saying, "Why are you doing this? We're trying to do good." And they are trying to do good, and they are doing good. But the nice thing with every topic in the universe except chickens is that I was written up in the Toronto paper, this weird sort of article saying that I was as if I was picking on the nerd in the schoolyard and kicking him through my website. He didn't get it at all. But the nice code of this story is that I got a chat transcript from the official Wikipedia IRC chat where Jimbo Wales was there, and his name was registered, so it was probably actually him. And someone sent the link, like, "Oh yeah, I saw that," and he gave the guy a cupcake, and he said, "There you go, a fictional cupcake from the real Jimbo Wales." The end. So, I guess the conclusion is, vandalizing Wikipedia can be justified under certain circumstances. And if you link to a pre-vandalized version, others won't have to vandalize it on top of that. You can see the joke of having to redo it yourself. That was my justification to the Wikipedia editors who wrote me and were upset. And I felt bad. The other strange thing with Wikipedia is there's an article about me on Wikipedia, and I didn't write it. But a friend of a friend had to, because it started out and it was full of like half-truths and like telephone game information. It was all slightly wrong. And so I sort of corrected it, and then I found out you shouldn't edit your own Wikipedia article, so it was reverted because I was too close. And then the most real thing was I had editors, they wanted to delete the Ryan North Wikipedia page. They had editors writing me and saying, "You need to justify your existence to Wikipedia. We need references." I felt really weird justifying myself to Wikipedia. So I said, whatever falls out of this, I'm happy with. I don't judge my self-worth by a Wikipedia page. Although it turns out a lot of people do, and they're freaked out when they're like, "Brian has a Wikipedia page. This is weird. What's going on?" And it is weird. It's the thing with it's a phrase, internet famous, and I feel dumb saying it because it's dumb to say, "Look at me, I'm famous." But if you're going to have fame, it's the best sort of fame because you go outside and nobody knows who you are. You can turn it off. You get a big head in the morning from emails, and then you go and buy some fruit, and people spill orange juice on you, and they don't care. So it's nice. But it does add a weird imbalance to relationships where you meet someone, and they know you through the strip. They've heard all my stories that I've shared in the comic, but I don't know anything about them. And they're pretty sure they like me, but I don't know them yet. And so it's, especially when you're dating someone, it's kind of weird. But you get past that, and then you can have a romantic relationship with a human being, which I encourage. Next question, please. Oh, I wish I had a better story. Your version is way better. What happened was I was in a class in my last year of undergrad where we had to do something cool with the internet, and we each got a randomly assigned domain name. QWANTZ.com was ours. And after a few weeks, my group really hadn't done anything. So I was like, "Screw you guys, I'm putting up some comics I was working on." And we won the class, which was nice. But it was, you're right, there must have been something I wanted to do when I started the comic to express myself. But I think it was just, I really liked comics and wanted to see if I could do them. And I thought it would be neat to do a comic without being a cartoonist. And you reminded me, the big idea I had initially was I was going to do comics where you would tell a joke and not be dumb about it, like not do lowest common denominator humor. You could tell a joke and maybe tell something cool about the world at the same time. And that lasted for like a week because I found out that people already done this before and I wasn't this huge rebel who's not telling dick jokes exclusively. And sometimes dick jokes are hilarious, so I put those in the comic anyway. Other hate mail. There's been a few. I can't remember them. I got one guy who wrote me. No, this is actually in person. This was hate communication in person. I was at a convention, and you're sitting at the convention table, and it's this weird imbalance because you're sitting and the person is standing, so you're looking up. And this guy comes by, and I was at an anime convention, basically as a favor to a friend, because I don't really do anime, nor do I do furry comics. And this guy comes by, and he's like, "Oh, this is Dinosaur Comics." Flips through the book. He's like, "I've heard of this. You're not really a cartoonist." And I was like, "Yeah, I just write. I'm not really a cartoonist. That's true." And he's like, "Yeah, you're not." Puts it down, walks away, and I was like, "Okay." You don't really get me when I concede the point. Like, we're on even ground still. But that's sort of like laughable hate. I've never really got an email from someone that made me feel, I shouldn't say, they're going to get like 5 when this goes online. And they'll be like, "You jerk, I hate you." But I've never gotten an email that made me feel bad about myself, really. And I think there might be, it's interesting, because I've talked to some female cartoonists about email they get, and there are some who get really hyper-sexualized messages from male fans. And I think there's kind of a gender split there, because I've gotten emails from women I don't know saying, "Hey, Ryan, I'd love to have your babies." And I go, "Ha, ha, ha. Clearly, we're all joking here." But it's somehow different when if I was a female cartoonist getting a message from a man saying, "Hey, Ryan, you're going to have my babies." There's a split there. A creepy sort of schism. So I think it is, when you're a woman online, the sad fact is people are going to judge you a lot more off how you look than they would if I'm a man. I haven't combed my hair for years. I feel confident in my body, but I don't see messages saying, "Hey, Ryan, yeah, his comic's good and he's fucking hot." And I'm fine with that, because I'd rather you read the comic than check me out. But I've seen comics written by women like, "Oh yeah, man, I love that comic, and she's fucking hot." The work is what you're supposed to be looking at. So I think it's harder for women to be a cartoonist online just because the responses you get from guys shift. They're more sexual. "You're having my babies" versus "I want to give you my baby." Babies.
Have you ever contemplated going into work in any other media, like writing a book or something outside of Dinosaur Comics?
Yeah, I have a couple times, and this is where Dinosaur Comics kind of stumbles me up, because I've had a few really good ideas for books, and then I turn them into comics. I did a comic this year about the King Midas story where, everything he touches turns to gold. Except in this story, it was more realistic. So, like, his wish comes true, and then the air touching his lungs starts turning to gold, so he's suffocating, and the gold's spreading out through the earth because he's in contact with it, and the earth turns to gold, and the earth loses its magnetic core because it's now solid gold, and the plates start to crumble, and the earth's collapsing. Then it's going to spread out from that, where aliens would use it as a power source, because you could convert anything into gold. You can do stuff with that, but you have to keep it in a magnetic field, because if it touches anything, your ship turns to gold. Anyways, I had this huge adventure. And I was like, you know what, I'll just do a comic, 6 panels, scratch that itch, done. And that day had like 5 paragraphs of alt text describing what was going to happen. So I haven't really done much beyond that, because this sort of scratches the writing itch. A couple of years ago, I tried to write an animated version of Dinosaur Comics. I had this idea where it would be the same animation all the time, and the words would change, which is a terrible idea, because comics let you cheat with time. Panel 2, he's just saying gasp. It only takes you a split second to have that gasp and move on, but other days he's saying a full sentence. And this were animated, he'd be talking, and you just hear, Which is funny once, but on the 23rd episode, you're like, come on, let's move this along. So it was a bad idea, and I'm glad I didn't follow through with my bad ideas. Would I have to do the voice?
Like, I guess based on an existing voice, be like your voice and then like, wow, that sounds a lot like Robert Downey Jr.
I mean, they all kind of sound a lot like me, but if I were casting it, it's all going to be next generation. Patrick Stewart for T-Rex. Brent Spiner. I don't know, Deanna? But yeah, I'd cast the Star Trek people. Often do I get writer's block? It's interesting. I do all I can not to get it. I have files of ideas, like I said, where I can go back to them. Very recently, I got a backlog of one comic. So for the past 5 years, I would get up at 7, write the day's comic, get done around 10, and put it up. And if it took me an extra hour, the comic would be an hour late. This is really unprofessional. This is what I was doing for 5 years. I couldn't get that one extra comic done. I finally got it done. I was talking to Randy from SKCD. He also just got a little bit of a backlog. We're both so proud of ourselves to be real cartoonists who don't do it the morning of every day. So a backlog's nice. If you can build it up more, you can take a day off if you're really pooched. But there are some mornings where I'm there writing from like 7 to 2 or 3. And that sucks because you're staring at these panels and you're trying to make a joke work for 6 hours. It gets to a point where you're convinced you don't have a sense of humor anymore. And even if it was funny, you wouldn't be able to tell. So you've been staring at it for so long. And at that point, it's nice to leave it, come back the next day, if you can have that luxury, and look at it with fresh eyes and say, you know what, 20 revisions ago, this was a good comic. I'm just going to roll it back to when it was funny. So I do all I can to avoid writer's block. When it happens, you just power through. And if I'm stuck, I'll try changing the times in which the panels are taking place. Maybe if someone off-panel talk, maybe throw in some swear words and see what happens. I use, for writing the comics, the question was, do I use version control? I use the poor man's version control for this, which is an infinite undo buffer. So if I see something I like, I'll copy, paste it to the bottom of the file so I can always have it to go back to. And if I get messed up, we'll just roll back until where I had it. But nothing as fancy as like checking in my first version of the comic in the morning and then signing it out to do edits. Yeah. The closest I came to that was flipping it. I had a series early on. The question was, have I ever considered rearranging the panels? I had a series early on where it was taking place in a mirror universe. So I mirrored the comic and gave them all little goatees. But beyond that, the problem with the mirrored universe was that the panels totally didn't work. It started out with T-Rex and then a close-up, and it was all backwards, and the narrative was ridiculous. And so I've kept it this way. I had this idea for a while where I was going to add a bird flying by in the background, but move him a pixel a day. So he just very slowly moved. But then I was like, I'm doing it because I can. Like, there's no reason for a bird to be there. So I guess we should close it up. Maybe one more question. It's you. This is actually a good time to ask me when tomorrow's comic is, because before this trip, I worked really hard and built up a 5-day buffer. And then I'm burning through it right now, and I'm going to be dead when I get back. Tomorrow's comic, I don't remember what it's about. It might be about a guy. I wish I had I could actually answer this question if I was more in tune with what I write. But I wrote 5 and I mixed them up. And the one that was up on Friday was the one I wrote the most recently. So I'm all confused over. It'll be a surprise to me on Monday, too. So thank you all so much for coming. This is great and fantastic.